I went to the kitchen and I remember grabbing a knife and walking up the stairs. I remember every step going up the stairs and how I thought about killing her and stabbing her to death. And everything began to just turn red. A lot of times people think that Genie and I are like this fairy tale couple and that we're perfect and we never fight. But the truth is we come from a really dark place. A lot of abuse, brokenness, dysfunction, but God had another plan for us. So I'm Canadian born, Hakka Chinese. My parents came from India. I grew up eating a lot of spicy Chinese and Indian food, and I always loved my Indian sweets. I have two siblings, a sister who's 4 years older and a younger brother who's 10 years younger. So in our family, we were raised Buddhist, kind of Catholic, but I hated religion. I would consider myself more of like an agnostic or atheist. My childhood wasn't bad, but it was turbulent at times. And you see, I had a big issue with self-confidence, and I felt like I wasn't good enough. I took it out on other people, and I was just searching for acceptance, for something more that was just missing inside of me. And so partying, doing drugs, alcohol, and at the time we went to this birthday party and underage drinking. I was drunk and I saw this girl come in, and I remember telling my friends that that's the kind of girl I want to marry. And a short while later, Genie and I started dating. But about 2 weeks after we started dating, her mom passed away from cancer. It was devastating for her because, you see, Genie came from a single parent home. Her father left when she was 4 years old, and so her mother was the only steady thing in her life until she passed. We had a lot of communication, a lot of dysfunction in our dating relationship, but we fell in love and we decided, well, let's get married. So she was 18 and I was 19. We had our first son, Joseph. After Joseph's born, it's the 100 days celebration party. It's a Chinese tradition where you have family, you have friends who come and see the baby for the first time. We are planning it at my mom's place. It's gonna happen at my mom's place. And so the day comes eventually. Genie's like, I'm gonna go out to the mall. I'll be back around 4 p.m. She ends up going out, and 4 p.m. rolls around and she hasn't come back, and so I'm calling her. I call her a dozen times. She's not responding to my texts. And eventually she answers and she says, me and the baby aren't coming. And after we get off the phone, I lose it. And you have to understand, back then, the type of person I was, very destructive and dysfunctional. And so I would punch walls, I would destroy cell phones. We went through 5 cell phones when we were dating because I destroyed them all. And I just had this uncontrollable anger, this burning anger that I couldn't get a hold of. And so that night, I go to the party myself and everyone's asking, where's the baby? And I'm like, well, they're not coming. And by the end of the night, I'm absolutely furious. And so I end up going home, Genie's home at this point in time. When I get into the house, I went to the kitchen and I remember grabbing a knife and walking up the stairs. I remember every step going up the stairs and how I thought about killing her and stabbing her to death. And everything began to just turn red because I was so angry. And I remember smashing the door open, and I remember her sitting on the bed with our son on the phone, and she was changing his diaper at the time. And I yelled, where were you? And I remember her ignoring me, and it just made me even more and more angry. I remember putting the knife down on the table, and eventually I grabbed the phone from her and I throw it on the floor. She continues to change our son's diaper, and after she picks him up from the bed, I go to grab him because I haven't seen him for the whole day. And as I do so, she swats my hand, and I instantly react. All of the fury and anger becomes uncontrollable, and I begin swinging at her punches. And I remember burning just with this red hot anger, and it was a spirit of murder. I wanted to kill her. I wanted her dead. And the police eventually came. You see, her friend had actually called the police during that time frame, and so the police come and arrest me. I remember sitting in the back of the cruiser and thinking, how could my life turn out like this? I moved back home. I'm depressed. I hit rock bottom, and Genie wants a divorce. She makes that clear through my parents. And I feel a failure as a father, as a man, a husband. And I sink into depression, and during those months I begin cutting myself with an X-Acto knife. Hundreds of times. I remember just feeling completely lost and isolated and a failure. And so I began a real search for meaning, a search for God and what is the purpose of life. Eventually I start to study science and history and taking a look at apologetics. Things like, why is there evil in this world? How could God let evil exist? And I look into cosmology and evolution and creation, and how does that fit in with the Bible? And there's all these questions that I've been searching for my life, but I've never found the answers to, real answers. You know, during those times I would go with Michael Uncle, and so we would drive to the lawyers, go to the courthouse, different things like that, and he was brilliant. He had a genius class IQ, he had a photographic memory, and during those times when, you know, we were together, he and I would talk about a lot of the questions that I kind of had on God and life and all these things. And he would be able to recite books that he had read like 30 years ago. He'd be able to recite paragraphs or pages of these books. Just, he was brilliant. And he shared so much wisdom and knowledge. He was an agnostic. He had gone through a rough life. His dad was an alcoholic, was abusive, and used to beat him to a pulp. His mom would actually jump in front of him to protect him, and as a result, one time she was pregnant, and his dad beat her so badly that Michael Uncle's brother was born disabled. And so Michael Uncle hated him, and so he had been scarred with all this trauma. And in our conversations, though, we would talk about God. Does he exist? And all these things. And through that search, that was actually how I came to faith. And eventually I came to a reasonable and logical explanation to God and to life, and that I had a purpose in life. But you see, knowledge is not the same as understanding. The mind needs to make the connection to the heart. And so one night in my bedroom, I'm kneeling on ground, feeling absolutely hopeless with life. I'd just finished cutting myself to numb the pain of life. And so I'm on my knees and I ask God, do you exist? And if you do, forgive me for all of the harm, all of the hurt that I've done to people. And I want to know you if you exist. And I want to serve you if you do. Forgive me. And as I say those words, this tidal wave of love just sweeps over me, and it's so intense, so real, so tangible. And in that moment I knew that God loved and accepted me, someone who was so messed up, so broken. I knew God was real and that he loved me. And when I got off the floor and I wiped the tears from my eyes, I realized that the anger, the bitterness, the unforgiveness, all of the hurts had melted away instantly. And that spirit of anger, of suicide, was driven out. It was gone. And you know, fast forward, so I called Genie and I'm like, hey, don't hang up, just like hear me out. And I tell her everything that's happened to me with this experience with God and how I feel like a brand new person. And I tell her, you know, I vowed that I would fight and protect our marriage, and I want to be the man, the husband that you deserve, the father that our son deserves. And I'm just so excited sharing this with her. And I, you know, ask for forgiveness, and I tell her, like, you don't have to forgive me now, but I want you to know that I'm gonna protect our marriage. Like I said our vows, you know, on our wedding day, we said our vows, and I want to honor that, and I want to honor you and become the man that you deserve. And I'm like, okay, she's gonna feel the same way. And so I completed, and she goes, are you done? And I'm like, yes. And then she hangs up the phone. And you see, like, normally I would take the phone and smash it against the wall and start punching things, but I had this peace on the inside that couldn't be shaken, it couldn't be taken. This peace that came from knowing that God had plans for me, and that I was trusting in Him now for my future, whatever that was. I have this peace after Genie hangs up the phone on me, and I begin to declare over my marriage that let no one separate what God has joined. And I would declare that all throughout the day, because I had to begin fighting for my marriage. And even though it looked like it was doomed, I had to just fight. And so I'd pray, and it was a tough time, but I had this peace. I had this peace on the inside. A short time later, eventually, Genie called me back, and she says, I forgive you. Will you forgive me? I want to work this out, and I love you. And I remember just being blown away of how she could forgive someone like me, and how were we going to move forward with this. And so, you know, we eventually owned up to our own faults. We forgave each other. We decided we're never going to use divorce as an excuse ever again, or a weapon. We decided never to bring up the past. We decided that we were going to cleave to each other, stick to each other. And so instead of fighting, you know, we worked together. Instead of, you know, tearing each other apart, we built each other up. And I remember this road exactly. It was Old Kennedy, close by where we were at the time. And so we're driving, and there's this really slow driver. So I'm like, I need to cut this guy off. And so I end up speeding up. I overtake him, I cut him off, and there's a cop who radar guns me. He catches me, and he pulls me over. He asks for my ID, checks me up on the system, and eventually he comes back to the car, and then he asks, do you want to explain yourself? And so I figure, okay, I'm going to do what they do in the movies. I'm going to tell him that I want to speak to my lawyer. And so that's what I say, and then he asks me to step out of the car, and he begins to arrest me, and he puts me in cuffs. And during this time, Genie calls my dad, who's not too far away, and I'm just praying in the backseat of a cruiser, and I'm like, God, I just trust you. And at this point in time, you gotta remember, I still have this restraining order. I'm not allowed to talk to her, I'm not allowed to see her, I can't be within 500 feet of her. As he's arresting me, he actually sees that I have 2 cell phones that day, and I guess he figures there's this Asian punk kid, he has 2 cell phones, he must be a drug dealer. And so he calls the Asian gangs and drug unit. This other officer number 2, comes, and he starts interrogating me. And he's like, do you smoke, do you drink, drugs, and all this? And I'm like, no. And he's like, if I search this car, I'm not gonna find any drugs or alcohol or whatever. And I'm like, go ahead, like, search the car. It's my dad's Corolla. It's a champagne colored Corolla, you know the type. Eventually he calms down, and he's kind of going back and forth. And I tell him, like, well, I didn't want to incriminate myself, so I just said, like, I want to speak to my lawyer. And eventually there's a couple of back and forths, and, you know, my dad's talking to the officers, and Eventually the officer one comes back and he, starts saying like, look, you're not supposed to be within 500 feet of her. You're in breach of the restraining order, and I've called this in. And then he says, but I'm gonna let you go. And I'm like, what? And so he's like, I'm gonna let you go. Your dad has said that you're trying to provide for your family, you're trying to serve God. I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna make this go away. He uncuffs me and he lets me go, even though I'm guilty as charged and I've breached this restraining order, and he's gonna let me off. And so he wrapped things up, he let me go. I'm off the hook, even though I disobeyed the law. I was guilty. And I don't want that to escape you, that my father petitioned on my behalf and I was guilty, but I was forgiven, I was let go, I was pardoned, absolved. And isn't it funny how God works? That God provided a way that we could be reconciled with Him. That even though we can never live up to the perfect standard of God, but yet in our brokenness, God still loves us. He loved us so much that He sent Jesus, His Son, to die for us. And so God provides this way for me to get out of this situation, to get out of these handcuffs, and He uses my dad to get me away, get me out of this situation. And the area that we were the weakest in, that we failed in, is the area that we are now the strongest in. And so, we've matured in faith, obviously, in so many different areas of our walk, but we've learned to break a lot of the negative cycles that we carried into our marriage because of all of the baggage and things that just accumulated in our childhood and our young life. And so at that time, I was at the darkest place in my life. It was the hardest place that I ever was. And when I look back, I can't sometimes believe that it actually happened. I've been through those tough times, the worst times of my life, the opportunity to go through them and to learn the lessons that I did and to become the man and the husband that I needed to be for Genie and our family together. And so today, it's, our personal relationship, me and Genie, is so amazing. And with our 3 kids, we have such an amazing relationship with them. And Jesus is the foundation of our family, of our home. All of the garbage that once was, and the man that I used to be, person that I used to be, and how God has worked through all of the mess of our life in our marriage, and how He's restored it and He's made it even better than it could ever have been. And so I just want to encourage you that God is a loving God, and He wants a relationship with you, a personal relationship with you. And if He can save and change a sinner and a person like me, a person who was so messed up and filled with so much junk, I know He can change you, that He can save you. There was a time when Michael Uncle was sick. He was in his deathbed at the hospital. He was unconscious on the machines. And I remember before we left, I prayed over him and I whispered in his ear and I told him how all those years ago when Genie and I were separated, how the conversations that we had, those conversations are what led me to the Lord and finding God. And I remember at the time, him being an agnostic atheist, we talked for so many hours about if God was real. And I told him I had found God, the God that we were unsure of. And I told him that one day I wanted to see him in heaven. I wanted him to forgive his father. And Michael Uncle hated him so much that he never even went to his funeral. And he had a lot of friends who had abandoned him throughout his life. He led a life of pain and trauma. And so I told him, I want to see you in heaven one day, and I want you to forgive your father, because one day I want to see you in heaven, and the only way is if you forgive those who've hurt you, and I know God will forgive you. And I remember leaving the hospital, and the next morning my mom called and she said that she had spoken to my aunt, and my mom said that Michael Uncle had woken up in the middle of the night, and he had a conversation with my aunt, and he shared with her how he had heard every single word that I said, and that he was no longer afraid to go. And eventually he fell back asleep and he passed away. But it's amazing how my uncle led me to the Lord, and in turn, before he passed, I was able to lead him to the Lord.